Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Calvin Ramsey, and I'm one of the managers here at the Boho 75 Soho store. It gives me great honor and privilege to stand next to Mr. O'Leary himself. We are very excited to have him in the space, and we're more importantly excited to hear about all of his expertise and knowledge in the industry, talking about his experiences, understanding and knowing all of the songs of Bowie. Without further ado, we are here to thank you, and we are very excited to hear what you have to say today. And thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out today. And here we are, Mr. Chris O'Leary himself.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody saw that, but my reading glasses just broke. So I'm still good, but the problem with getting a little older is that now you have to do this kind of thing. Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Chris O'Leary. In 2009, I started writing about every single David Bowie song in order as a whim, and now it's 2021. And that's the second of two books that came out of the project. This book, Ashes to Ashes, starts with the Iggy Pop record Bowie co-wrote and produced called The Idiot, and it ends with Blackstar, sadly, the last chapter. Today I'm going to be talking about what went into an album called One Outside, which came out in 1995. The story of how we get here to the album called One Outside is a bit of a convoluted one. It took about 3 years in total, and it starts at a wedding. The wedding, of course, of David Bowie and Iman in Florence, Italy in summer of 1992. At the wedding reception, Bowie and Eno talked about work. They hadn't really talked to each other in years. Bowie commandeered the DJ system to play some of his current demos, pieces with what he called distressed instruments, and Eno was intrigued. Bowie seemed to have been awoken from a long slumber in the 80s, and they agreed tentatively to collaborate again. As Bowie said, we were suddenly on the same course again. Eno had spent the 1980s making ambient instrumental albums. He brewed perfumes. He mulled ideas like quiet clubs and research gardening. He did a tropical rainforest sound installation for the World Financial Center, and what really paid the bills being half of the production team that delivered U2's The Unforgettable Fire, The Joshua Tree, and Achtung Baby. In September of '89, he told an interviewer, "I'm sure if someone held a gun to my head, crank out a record of songs, but at this point in time, I know it wouldn't be any good because there's no conviction to carry it forward." And 9 months later, he made a record of songs with John Cale from the Velvet Underground. Other song albums would follow in the early 90s. So as Eno was moving towards pop, Bowie was moving away from it. He had been trying in bits and pieces to experiment for years with his band Tin Machine, with particularly 1993's The Buddha of Suburbia, sort of a avant-garde soundtrack that he built out of pieces of other pieces. Eno considered that pretty strong work. Talking to the writer Dylan Jones in 1994, Bowie said he wanted to, quote, stop mucking about and write for himself instead of for an audience. And of all people, Axl Rose was a confidant to one conversation with Bowie. And he recalled Bowie saying, "One side of me is experimental, and the other side of me wants to make something that people can get into, and I don't know why. Why am I like this?" This is Axl's paraphrase, by the way. So, pairing with Brian Eno would hopefully strengthen his resolve. As Eno said of the Low period, "I think my big contribution was in encouraging Bowie not to retreat from extreme positions." The thing was, if Brian Eno and David Bowie were going to collaborate again, it faced colossal expectations. The albums they had collaborated on in the late 70s, Low, Heroes, Lodger, had become classics by the early 90s, revered albums. So they knew they couldn't do a fourth Berlin album. It was played out. Eno said, "We don't want to make another record of songs. There's got to be a bigger landscape in play than that." So, because this is Brian Eno, they start out with Theory. thinking about what they didn't want to do. Closing off avenues leads to what they could do. Music for a dance troupe, La 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 Human Steps, an avant-garde musical. They began mailing each other what Eno described as mini manifestos. So at least when we went into the studio, we'd have a set of concepts to enable us to avoid all the things we find boring and bland in pop music. And their favorite method of sending these manifestos was that very 90s technology, the fax machine. In late 1993, Tin Machine guitarist Reeves Gabrels became part of it. He was on tour at the time with Paul Rodgers of the classic rock group Bad Company, and Gabrels would find himself in the strange position of returning to his hotel after playing Feel Like Making Love and Bad Company on stage to find mini manifesto faxes from Bowie and Brian Eno, asking how songs in 11/8 time and 4/4 time playing simultaneously could align on the same note. And Reeves, probably at 4 a.m, had to sit down with a calculator and work this out. One promising idea they had was what they described as a heavy CD-ROM. Brian and I, Bowie said, are developing something from which the user will genuinely feel he has a full participation creatively. I assume most people are familiar with the CD-ROM. It was, the awkward transition stage between early PC games and internet games, and each of them released a CD-ROM in 1994. Bowie had Jump, where one could isolate tracks from his album Black Tie, White Noise, watch some blurry videos, spend a lot of time in this room where you just touch things and they made noises. And Eno had Head Candy, advertised as a mind-altering experience without the drugs, in which users donned prismatic glasses to see 3D images shifting to an Eno soundtrack. Again, imagine the quality of the computer monitors in most people's houses. It must have been a little, maybe not so incredible. Eno soon wrote off CD-ROMs as a typically disastrous new media adventure. But he still liked the idea of an album, an overstuffed, incomplete album, for which listeners controlled the narrative, quote, releasing something that says, here's a whole lot of things, you sort it out. The CD, which by the early 90s was the dominant form of music medium, had already helped to kill LP listening habits. It had broken the traditional listening structure of tapes and LPs. There was no longer a side one and a side two. Now there was just an opening number, and then a flat stream of music. There were often more songs. There were longer songs. You could easily jump around the CD. You could program your player to resequence it, shuffle tracks, play only your favorites. So on his 1992 CD, NerveNet, Eno put 2 mixes of the same song on it, figuring listeners would skip the one they didn't like. Make the medium fail, Eno said. Do something that sounds like it's bigger than something that can be fitted onto a CD. Eno expected musicians to release unfinished tracks on CDs or CD-ROMs, albums that would be on the cusp of games and music and demonstration, whatever demonstration may mean. In terms of games, perhaps an album that worked like an interactive text game. And here's an early one that tormented my childhood. It was called Bedlam. My parents might remember this one. And in these games, you ask questions, you get gnomic answers, you try to figure the story out from only a handful of fragmented details. As Bowie said, I like things that tend to be endless puzzles. With this in mind, they assembled a small group of musicians in mountain studios in Montreux, Switzerland in March of 1994. The intention was to get these players in a room and just completely improvise. There'd be a couple of demos to start with, but not really. This is nothing like this is an A major and then there's going to be an A bar bridge and I want this to sound like blah, blah, blah. Nothing like traditional tracking. These musicians were, and these are Bowie's drawings of them, Reeves Gabrels, his friend and Tin Machine guitarist. Mike Garson, who hailed from the Ziggy Stardust and Young American days. who was back in the mix. He's worked with Bowie a little bit on the Buddha of Suburbia record. Not shown, Erdal Kazilke, a Turkish musician whom Bowie had worked with through most of the 80s and into the early 90s. And a newcomer, the drummer Sterling Campbell. His connection was that he had been the pupil of Bowie's great 70s drummer Dennis Davis. So they had everybody in the room together, and Eno was concerned about the inherent fatal flaw of musicians jamming, mostly rock musicians. Jazz musicians were another story, but rock musicians, Eno thought, had a tendency to get boring really quickly. At some point, as if by entropic force, everyone starts playing the blues in jams, he says. Eno hated this. He said he was a sworn enemy of the 12-bar blues by session musicians. How do you keep people fresh? And one idea was role-playing. Eno devised characters for each musician to play, with his usual caveat that no one would tell the others what they were doing, what their instructions were. These were in the vein of science fiction pieces he'd been writing recently. Bowie would be a town crier figure. In Bowie's words, it was my job to pass on all the events of the day in a society where informational networks have broken down. This is from Eno's diary. This is some of his roles. Reeves Gabrels is in the house band of the Third Moon of Jupiter. Sterling Campbell was a disgruntled member of a South African rock band, or he was playing on a moon satellite. Mike Garson would be a morale booster for a, quote, small ragtag terrorist operation. Erdal Kazilke had to play Arabic funk to win over the father of a woman he wanted to marry, and Kazilke just did not get that at all. And Bowie wanted more to talk. He didn't want to, he had a keyboard with him in the studio, but he rarely played it. He didn't really want to sing. He'd wade into his album. On the first day when the musicians assembled, Bowie greeted them wearing overalls. He was going to paint throughout the sessions, not really perform. He had canvases, wallpaper hangers, and before playing, the musicians helped him redecorate the studio. Gabrels recently said that if you, quote, if you push the volume up on outside, you can sometimes hear the pastels Bowie is using on newsprint on the easel. You can hear Bowie scraping away. The impetus was, again, on unstructured jamming, the musicians punching in around 10 a.m., breaking for lunch, jamming through the afternoon. This went on for a couple of weeks. Hour-long tape reels captured everything. Eno kept using, again, in his war against boring jamming, strategies designed to stop the thing from becoming over-coherent, in his words. He had an archive of strange sounds, Bowie said. Eno employed it whenever he heard something getting conventional. He'd pipe into everyone's headphones loops of clock chimes and French radio broadcasts and Motown tapes. So Sterling Campbell playing drums could lock into a French weather report loop, alter the drum pattern, shift the direction of the improvisation. Bowie mostly painted, while Eno's directions after terrorizing the musicians were sort of like George Lucas behind the camera, continue, good. In a journal entry that it appeared in the David Bowie Is exhibit, Bowie wrote that he was happy that the music that the band was playing had no connection to his past work. And the peak moment came a week later, somewhere around March 12th, or Bowie recalled another time, March 20th, 1994. Everyone agrees it was one day. Most everyone agrees it was the last full day of recording. The band is again improvising for a couple of hours. Standing before a table covered with pages he'd ripped out of books and magazines and sheets of computer-generated lines, Bowie started riffing. He called it blindingly orgiastic. And in his riffing and in his sort of just speaking into a microphone, he created a setting. Oxford Town, New Jersey, a suburban take on the hunger city of Diamond Dogs. Placing the eerie environment of the Diamond Dogs city, now in the 90s, gives it an entirely different spin, he said. Then he begins to sketch and make up who were the people that could live there. Quote, a guy called Adler, and this other guy called Leon, and this very scary woman named Ramona, and there was some kind of murder thing that happened, and it had to do with the art world. Bowie had been spending a few years becoming part of the art establishment. He had become an avid collector of paintings. He favored British painters like David Bomberg. And he had joined the board of the magazine Modern Painters, where he scored a coup. This is his interview with his Swiss neighbor, Balthus. He was taking his own painting much more seriously. He'd soon collaborate with Damien Hirst. He'd have his first solo exhibition at the Gallery in London in 1995. "I don't think it's enough anymore to make a record," he said while making one outside. "It's a visual society now." But in his way, Bowie rated artists for shiny bits. He kind of took what he wanted from a bunch of artists. Components, he said, that were bitten off from the periphery of the mainstream. He took on the work of the Viennese painter Rudolf Schwarzkogler, wrongly believed to have castrated himself in performance. He did fall out a window, though, to his death, sadly. And to whose works, called Actions, Bowie paid homage, not just in also wrapping himself up in bandages and having fish put on him, but also the actions of Schwarzkogler were called 1, 2, 3 actions, just like there was supposed to be 1 outside, 2 contamination, and records that didn't get made. He also was interested in the works of Hermann Nisch, who performed blood rituals, sometimes using animal carcasses. His old favorite, Chris Burden, this is Bowie and Hermann Nisch at some point. His old favorite, Chris Burden, whose gallery works included being shot by a friend. And Ron Athey, whose scarifications. He and his collaborators would have their skin penetrated with the tissues that sopped up the blood, being hung like tiny flags on stage. Bowie was fascinated by Athey's work. He thought it was becoming domesticated, given the popularity of piercing and tattooing among the young, which to him, of course, suggested a growing paganism. It all flowed into a broader channel in Bowie's mind, his idea that the 90s seemed like the West was binging and purging before the millennium began, that there seemed to be everywhere a vogue for serial killer movies and TV shows, paranoia being soaked into everything from the JFK movie to the X-Files, Damien Hirst's shark and sheep cadavers, the influence of the late fashion photographer Guy Borden, developer of the heroin chic waif look. Art murder, the narrative concept of one outside, seemed like the natural next step, Bowie said, after, quote, conceptual muggings. Murder may be art if you can get away with it, Bowie said in 1995. So with this improvisation, something like 25 to 35 hours of material came out of these sessions. Eno recently said in the booklet to that box set that somewhere in his archives he has a complete 80-minute tape of this central improvisation sequence. They had something like a anti-opera, which we'll just provisionally call Leon, after one of its characters. It's still unclear what the intention was originally with what they had. A few songs they quarried from this big chunk of improvisation, taking bits, looping them, creating hooks and choruses. The Heart's Filthy Lesson, which you heard earlier, is one example of this that came out of these kind of long improvisations. It was a song that Bowie once wanted to write a lyric about, to be about English landscape painting, and Gabrels thankfully talked him out of it. And then there is kind of what we call the Leon Suites. This is a series of bootleg recordings between 22 and 27 minutes long, which Gabrels once said was stolen from mixing sessions in the summer of '94, with whoever stole them chopping them up into these suites. So the Leon bootlegs, which you can hear the usual places, they aren't unreleased edits by anybody involved in the recording, but the work of a bootlegger imposing their aesthetic ideas on Bowie and Eno, which kind of seems fitting given the nature of this project at this point. So, Leon is a very strange work. It's Bowie keeping to his instructions of being a reciting storyteller, cycles through words, shuffling them, lines like Laugh Hotel, Good Time Drone, Slug Mail, OK Riot, I Wanna Be Chrome, Heart Skin, and he has a taste of jargon from computer magazines. Update Daemon. Daemon was one of the first UK internet providers. Domain name servers, packet sniffers, which is a term for tools used to diagnose network bottlenecks. Gabrel said Bowie and Brian were going to release the album with no artist name on it. Just give the public enough that they may think that Bowie and Brian were involved, create a bit of a stir. But when the record company heard the album, they didn't feel there was a single on it. David was only going to get half the money he normally would get for an album. That situation wasn't acceptable. So there were more sessions then to create poppier songs. Songs like We Prick You, Hello Space Boy, Strangers When We Meet, Oxford Town. These came out of later sessions with different musicians. They were hookier and poppier. The album that finally emerged was something of a compromise between the vision, this chaotic vision of the Leon improvisations, and songs that were more in the spirit of Leon. As Bowie said, nobody would take Outside when we first recorded it. It was held back for a year. Towards the end of the year, Q magazine asked Bowie to contribute to their 100th anniversary issue by keeping a diary for 10 days. He was recording at the time, still working on these Leon songs, and he figured a true day-to-day account of his doings would be, quote, incredibly boring. He wondered what his private detective character would write instead, and this became The Diary of Nathan Adler, or The Art Ritual Murder of Baby Grace Ballou, and this became the crux of the One Outside record. As Gabrel said, the order and plot were imposed and invented by David after the fact. In Leon, Bowie is using a bunch of character voices, moving in and out of focus, now like a game of Clue. 5 characters, he gave distinct looks and possible motives. They're all based on me, he said. And in Bowie style, he dressed up as all of them. The first, of course, the protagonist of Outside was Nathan Adler. Bowie speaking in an Englishman's attempt at a hard-boiled gumshoe's voice. Nathan Adler, his direct ancestors were Philip Jeffries, the FBI agent Bowie played in Twin Peaks' Fire Walk with Me. Another ancestor was a character called Jack Grimaldi, played by Bowie's friend Gary Oldman in the 1993 film Romeo is Bleeding, a corrupt cop in a sexually obsessive relationship with a psychotic Russian mob assassin named, perhaps coincidentally, Mona. A private eye is usually the walking means to advance a detective story. He doesn't know anything, so he asks questions, pokes around, stumbles upon bodies and secrets, he shades in the plot. Nothing like this happens with Bowie's detective Nathan Adler. The more he talks, the more confusion there is. His name is Adler, after all. He's not even trying to solve a murder, only to determine if it qualifies as art, maybe for tax purposes. He's also a commercial artist who's based out of Mark Rothko's old apartment. A citizen of narrative in a postmodern world, Bowie said, Adler looks back rather nostalgically at a time when there was a seeming order to things. He's really rather despondent that things are broken into this fragmented, chaotic kind of state. Then the apparent villain of the piece, Ramona Stone, again played by David Bowie. She first appears in Berlin, 1977, running a Caucasian suicide temple, vomiting out her doctrine of death as eternal party into the empty vessels of Berlin youth, as per Bowie. She's a punk rock no future priestess who by century's end is in London, Canada, running a string of body parts jewelry stores. And for her voice, he multiply tracked himself, altering each vocal with harmonizing synthesizers. It was something of a premonition of Andy Serkis's Gollum voice in Lord of the Rings. There was someone whose picture I forgot to put up, Leon Blanc, the accused killer, Bowie said, whom he based on Tricky, the musician, someone he had befriended at the time. The mysterious Paddy, of whom nothing is known, because Bowie decided not even to do anything except one song called Hello Space Boy, which is pretty nebulous. And then Every Mystery Needs a Corpse, and this, on One Outside, it's Baby Grace Blue, whose body is found at the Museum of Modern Parts in Oxford Town, New Jersey. a really gruesome murder described in loving detail in the first section of Bowie's diary. Bowie said, "It's Baby Grace's voice that touches me most, perhaps because I based her story on a girl I know very well who's been through a whole bunch of bad relationships in which she was abused. It really seemed like she picked that kind of man each time." There was other references, like Laura Palmer, obviously, from Twin Peaks. And lastly, there was a character called Algeria Touch Shriek, Bowie playing an old man like a refugee from his 60s songs, all the confirmed bachelors and elderly shoplifters, and also a reference to 1984 to a character called Charrington. So the compromise was to have an album in which all these characters would have little bits in which they spoke, interspersed with more conventional songs. Once Leon was reincarnated as one outside, it was meant to sound like 1995, Bowie said. It was meant to sound like a year that got pressed onto a disc, like flower petals were crushed in a book. The plan was he and Eno would then release a new album each year until 2000, and so they would chronicle the dying century in a, quote, contextual diary. Bowie said he'd use his computer to find out who killed Baby Grace, wrap up the plot early on, so you can move on to more interesting things. One foresees at the end of all this, you may have 20 or 25 different characters flying around, he said. It'll be the Nicholas Nickleby of rock by the time it's finished. It was going to culminate in a live performance at the Salzburg Festival, directed by Robert Wilson. Bowie would star as Nathan Adler. It was supposed to be 8 hours long. Bowie said, "Pack a sandwich." And then the years passed. In 1999, the satirical newspaper The Onion ran a series of letter-writing campaigns to celebrities, and one of these begged Bowie to finally complete the One Outside storyline. As The Onion went, "Your musical tale of the art murder of Baby Grace was all fans could talk about for months. During that time, you could step into any small-town bar, and the topic of conversation would always be the same. Who killed Baby Grace? Some suspected the tyrannical futurist Ramona Stone." By then, the idea that Bowie would ever finish his art murder mystery was as shaky as the storyline itself. But he kept promising. The sequel albums were going to appear, along with the theatrical production. In Eno's diary, Eno wrote that Bowie was excited about staging Leon, a conflation of the original Leon things and what we're doing now. So even though it was supposed to be a 5-album hypercycle, it became a trilogy. The sequel was supposed to be called To Contamination. It was slated for spring of 1997. It would have, Bowie said, some bearing on the first one, but it's completely different. It goes backwards and forwards between Indonesian pirates of the 17th and 18th centuries, and today it's really becoming a peculiar piece of work. In 97, Eno relocated to Russia, possibly to get away from all of this. Bowie spent much of the year touring Earthling, but these sequel albums were still always about to begin. In March of 97, Bowie said he and Eno had, quote, formulated the storyline and decided to do it ourselves with no other musicians. We'll send the tracks back and forth between St. Petersburg and Russia and wherever I am. So again, the mini manifesto concept. The Vienna production was still underway, but now To Contamination was going to have a lot of an internet component. Bowie said, what we like to do is bump up all kinds of stuff on the internet, so you'll get lots of photographic references, like a Ripley's Believe It or Not premise. The focus would now be on infectious diseases, Ebola, AIDS, that new tuberculosis. It's kind of scarily, premonitions. Trent Reznor was supposed to be involved. But then more time passed until the director of the Salzburg Festival went public saying he'd stopped hearing from Bowie. The Millennium stage production was not going to happen. In a late 1999 web chat, Bowie said he still hadn't found time to sift through what had now become, in descriptions, over 24 hours of material. Then in 2000, February 2000, he told the users of his service, BowieNet, this would be the year. At last, the millennium, He would piece together contamination, and instead he played Glastonbury. He had a kid, and he re-recorded his 60 songs for an album called Toy. So there would be nothing else. No CD-ROMs, no websites, no operas, no movies, no new Nathan Adler diaries, no grand concert with Eno to mark the millennium in Vienna. No more work ever with Eno. Bowie ended the 20th century doing everything but continuing this outside sequence. It's as if, all along, it was a conceptual art project and a bit of a hoax that Bowie conducted in the press. From the beginning, he was thinking about this as the end game. In his 1994 journal, he writes, "The intention to falsify a concert at a mythical venue and have it reviewed by a cooperative journo, to resample and reconstruct ingredients of the 76-79 Berlin albums and create a fourth so-called lost album. In Bowie's words, an album, in short, that was never really made. The longer the sequels and the concerts didn't exist, the grander they became. Fans began circulating hoax sequences of these never-made records, songs like Ebola Jazz and The Mad Ramblings of Longbeard. It was an inspired an ending as any." Bowie's last thoughts on this project were in 2003. He said, "We did record an awful lot of stuff, and there really is every intention of going through it and putting out part 2 and part 3. It would have been nice to have done it as a theatrical trilogy. I just don't have the patience. I think Brian would have had the patience." Toward the end of his life, Bowie reportedly wanted to pick up the threads finally, get back together with Eno, finally complete One Outside, finally solve the murder of Baby Grace. And who's to say it wouldn't have happened? He did write his musical after all. But the end products were beside the point. The vast pile of stuff, the CD-ROMs, the reels of tape, the role-playing games, the visits to mental institutions, paintings of minotaurs, obscurantist diaries. The process is what had mattered to him. He had needed all of it, this sprawling apparatus, this great jerry-rigged dirigible to get off the ground, but now at least he was in the air. The thing that I find fascinating about Lazarus, his play, is that he actually did it for once. It was kind of a miracle, like he actually did his play. I think you're right in that he got his creative energy from thinking about how incredible it would be to do something. But the nuts and bolts of it were kind of boring to him, especially things like putting on plays and directing films that required a lot of work, a lot of people, a lot of money. I think he loved the planning stages of it and writing scripts and doing storyboards and that sort of thing. But I think he had more fun in that stage, and the idea of, I think, he probably did just sit down one day and be like, I can't go through 80 hours of these tapes. I did that and it's over, and I can't go back. So, hey. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Hi, so my name is Constantine, and it's a pleasure. I studied history, and I admire a lot of the history that you've put into your book. I actually have it on order online with the other cover with Pierrot and whatnot on it. And I just wanted to, it was a very interesting excerpt that you presented. I was just wondering, throughout his entire career, would you say that Bowie is a person who invents characters based upon the people in which he meets, or rather that the people that he meets become characters in the works that he creates? I know that's a little confusing.
No, I think I know what you mean.
Yes, thank you.
I think, Bowie was a pretty ravenous artist who took everything for inspiration. And so I think the idea that anybody he encountered, he could seize on something from them and use it.
Like a sponge.
Yeah, he was very much a sponge. And I think, as he said multiple times, these outside characters are all, in a way, bits of the David Bowie personality taken to extremes. So like Ramona Stone is this kind of vain, futurist, vampire figure, and Touch Shriek, the old man, is this very sad sack. Bowie always had this idea of like, what if I never became famous? What if I was still in Beckenham and I was an old man in 2015? You know, thinking about what could have been. That was always very compelling to him. So that, things like that, I think the characters are often very much him doing his persona in different guises.
It's just very interesting that, you know, he has his own personas and characters, and, you know, the people in which he meets, he makes into characters, and the other way around as well. It's just very interesting, and like I said, once again, I appreciate the research that you've done.
Thank you.
It's excellent.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you.
This period of Bowie that you covered is murky for me, and what I find interesting about it, and I'd love if you could talk about this, is I've written a bit about Bowie's relationship to, for lack of a better word, hit making. He would kind of go into and out of commercial mode. You touched on this a little bit in your intro. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this studio album, when it came out, was the first. He'd done some compilations and things, but it was the first since Black Tie, White Noise.
Yeah, the Buddha album was not released in America until around this time. It was a BBC thing, so like it didn't even get distribution until '95.
Right.
So yes, it's the follow-up to Black Tie, White Noise, essentially.
Right, and Black Tie, White Noise is kind of him trying to re-embrace what had happened with Let's Dance in 1983.
Yes, but sabotaging it also.
Well, okay.
In a way.
Let me not skirt past that. What was your impression? Like, how was Bowie both embracing and sabotaging, you know, commercial success such as it was?
In Black Tie, White Noise, that was a record he reunited with Nile Rodgers, who had made him a superstar with Let's Dance. And Nile Rodgers really was game to be like, let's do Let's Dance 2. Let's have some hits, you know, because he was in a slump also, Rodgers, at that point. And Rodgers would express frustration that he would have these great, funky, kind of New Jack Swing tracks that were radio ready, and Bowie would be like, no, let's not do that one. Let's do a duet with Lester Bowie, a jazz instrumental instead, or Palace Athena, which is this kind of sort of house track that doesn't really work as a house music either. So things like that, where he wants to be popular, but at this point he is chafing at making any compromises that would get him back on the radio, perhaps. Though I don't know, it would have been tough for him to get back on the radio, I think, in '93, anyhow.
I think you're right. And so I'm fascinated by what you said, where he turns in outside, the label says, we don't hear singles.
We don't hear a single.
And it's kind of like, well, he's David Bowie. At this point in his career, does he do singles?
Exactly.
Plus, he just tried the whole making a commercial album thing.
Yeah, it's weird. You think that they knew what they were getting into by the mid-'90s with him. Because EMI could tell everybody, you know, this guy is not making commercial records anymore. Right. But I think there was part of him, like I mentioned in that thing to Axl Rose, part of him, he still wanted hits. I think he still craved that too. So like he didn't do what Gabriel said, which was like put this out as an 80-minute CD without a name on it. Like he wanted some attention. He wanted to get on the cover of magazines also, and to be, you know, that he couldn't go all the way and be really avant-garde. He wasn't Scott Walker, sort of his lodestone of adventurous stuff. He never could go all the way and do that.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hey.
Do you know any, like, the inner side of the story? Do you know, like, if there was a rift between them? Or any background?
It's interesting. All we have basically is Eno published his diary from this period in a book, and he has, I think it was I skipped over it, but he has a bit of a passive-aggressive statement about this album when it gets released. He's like calls it like clotted up and overlong, but it's still very good. It's still very outside, But I have a feeling that Bowie got the sense that Eno, especially because the album didn't do that well, Eno kind of washed his hands of it pretty quickly, and I think Bowie was a bit like, okay. And I don't think Eno was really that interested in going back through the tapes again and doing To Contamination or that stuff. But we don't really have much after that of talking about the project, except in pretty general positive terms.
Thanks. Hi, Chris. Thanks for
Hi.
coming. I wonder if you think there's anything to the theory that I'm just thinking of now, that the Earthling sessions were sort of a reaction to the very controlled, very seemingly deliberate. I mean, Leon is obviously not that deliberate, but it seems like there was a very tightly controlled atmosphere, and then the next album is just sort of taking the anarchy of stage and putting it in the studio. I mean, do you think that Bowie was feeling a little constrained by that creative process, sort of deliberately or subconsciously, and that led to I Love Earthling? So
Yeah, I think so. I think Earthling it comes together really quickly. It's done in the studio in like a month with Gabrels and Mark Platty, just kind of throwing stuff into a computer and Bowie responding and doing vocals the same day. I think that's how Bowie worked. He was always reacting to the last thing. So I think he was a bit exhausted after all the Ramona Stone, narrative stuff, because he did many, many long interviews to promote this album in which he really got into the weeds of this concept. And I think he kind of was exhausted by that, and so he jumped on the opportunity to just do a pretty quick and pretty fast record in response to it. So yeah.
I will hold the mic up.
Hey, Glenn.
Predictably, I'm going to ask a Diamond Dogs question.
Yeah.
So
Glenn wrote 33 1/3 on Diamond Dogs, just FYI.
Why, thank you. You said very briefly that there were continuities between Outside and Diamond Dogs, and could you say anything more about specific or even general imagery, ideas, concepts, something about the world? Because once you showed the pictures, it didn't look like anything I remember from Diamond Dogs. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, as he said, it was the idea of this hunger city, which is the Diamond Dogs city with feral kids on roller skates living on the roofs of buildings, post-apocalyptic thing. Using that as a starting point, and then very quickly moving into more of a Twin Peaks thing, this Oxford town being like this strange suburban, New Jersey suburban town with art murders in it. So I think the parallels are more the idea of putting in all this imaginative effort into something that didn't really result in the way like the Diamond Dogs movie didn't happen. The idea of this incredible scaffolding of stuff that he devises that doesn't really produce any songs or movies. So.
Formally similar, but not.
Yeah, I don't think, especially musically, not really. No. So. Yeah, I mean, there's like the.
If you take out the segue.
Yeah.
Outside, some of it.
Yeah, and it's like the through line. There's like the jazz influence, which Blackstar. Oh, it's okay. Turns up again too. Yeah. So.
Hi, can you hear me? This is a great lecture. Thank you so much. So I'm wondering about Bowie as a subject for you, and why. I mean, obviously you must be fascinated by his songs to have written 2 books, especially of this length.
Yes, length.
So, can you say something about why Bowie? That's it. Why Bowie?
I think it's because it's just so fun because there's all this stuff that goes into it. I mean, he's really fascinating to write about. He's somebody who obviously was a massive reader and consumer of movies, and so it's not just music. It doesn't feel like a real stretch to bring in any other thing because you feel like, well, he probably did read that, or he probably did envision that idea. It's not a stretch to bring in Twin Peaks. Yeah, obviously, yeah. Like it's not a stretch to bring in all the painters he's talking about. He actually is responding to people like Ron Athey and Schwartz Kogler and all of them. So it's not. It just makes it more interesting than, someone who'd be maybe more strictly about music, especially because there's so many songs. For my own sanity, it helped to have other things to write about sometimes. Yeah. So.
What is your favorite, as a historian, what is your favorite types of sources to discover when you're composing and writing a piece of work? In general, just a general question.
I find the things that are most valuable are interviews people do at the time that maybe didn't get picked up. It could be something like an interview with a regional newspaper or a TV station where suddenly it's like because it's fresh and there's no like master narrative yet. Because I do feel that the problem with biographies is that you interview people 20 years later and they kind of have a story already. Whereas if you've just made the album, maybe you're fresher and you'll say some things like, yeah, that really was a disaster. I can't believe it came out. Like it was, or nothing like that. Or like, I really like this about it. Whereas, as time goes on, your memories harden. It becomes more like, oh, this is, this period and that period. So whenever I find like an obscure primary source like that, I find it interesting.
Yeah, I like obscure.
Yeah. So thanks.
So why Diamond Dogs and why Scary Monsters, other than the obvious repeating word in the title of the two songs? For your book titles.
It's kind of it's a pretty simple. My editor said, "Let's do Rebel Rebel," and then with Bowie's passing, Ashes to Ashes seemed like the unavoidable, second one. Rebel Rebel was always I was like, really? But he loved that song, so I was like, okay. I mean, I'm not committed to anything, and they're obviously they're huge records, and most people would know them. They're recognizable. Yeah, it's not The Heart's Filthy Lesson or Segway, Rona A. Stone or something like that. So.
Alrighties, everyone. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Chris and Larry. Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon.